The rope bit into Jacob Sterling's neck. Rough, scratchy hemp, digging into his skin like 1,000 tiny needles. He stood on a rickety wagon in the center of Pion Creek, a dusty, forgotten town that had decided today was his last. His hands were bound so tight behind his back his shoulders screamed. The sun was a hammer, beating down without mercy. The crowd was a monster, roaring with a single voice. "Murderer!" one man screamed. "Hang him high!" shrieked a woman, her face twisted in rage. Jacob stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the distant hazy mountains. He refused to let them see his fear. He'd faced death on battlefields where the air was thick with gunpowder and screams. And this quiet, hateful death felt almost like a release. But then his eyes found him. Standing in the crowd, watching without emotion, was his own brother. Marcus Sterling. His face was a cold, polished mask. There was no brotherly love there. No grief. Just the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a perfect plan come to its perfect end. A small, cruel smile played on Marcus's lips as the hangman gave the knot one final, brutal tug. The hangman nodded to the driver. The man cracked his whip. The horses tensed, ready to bolt and leave Jacob dancing on air. It was over. "Stop!" The shout sliced through the air like a razor. Every head in the square whipped around. A woman was shoving her way through the mob, her blue dress stained with the dust of a long journey. She was visibly pregnant, her belly round and full under the worn fabric. But she moved with the force of a hurricane, waving a piece of folded paper over her head. "I have a stay of execution," she yelled, her voice shaking but strong. "From the territorial judge." The hangman paused. The wagon driver lowered his whip. The crowd murmured, confused. "Let me see that paper, ma'am," the sheriff grumbled, a big man with a mustache like a walrus. Sarah Mae Henderson knew she had only seconds. The paper was a lie. It was a receipt for horse feed. But seconds were all she needed. As she pushed forward, her eyes locked with Jacob's. She didn't see gratitude in his gaze. She saw confusion, as if, even with a noose around his neck, her sudden appearance was the most puzzling thing he'd ever seen. The sheriff took the paper, his eyes narrowing. "This ain't no stay of execution." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The lie was falling apart. It was over before it even began. But just as the sheriff was about to toss the paper aside, Marcus Sterling, Jacob's own brother, stepped forward. "Sheriff," Marcus said, his voice smooth as silk, "perhaps we should hear the lady out. After all, we want justice for Samuel Morrison. True justice. We can't have any doubt about the legality of this hanging." Everyone stared at Marcus. Jacob's own brother, the man who'd been calling for his head, was now defending him? It made no sense. The sheriff, thrown completely off balance, hesitated. He looked at the pregnant woman, at the well-dressed Marcus Sterling, and at the restless crowd. "Fine," he finally grunted. "Take him back to the cell. We'll sort this out." As they pulled the noose from Jacob's neck, his eyes met Sarah's again. A silent question passed between them, a connection forged in a moment of impossible, desperate intervention. She had just saved his life. But what neither of them knew was that in doing so, she had just put them both in more danger than they could ever imagine. The hanging was just the beginning. 2 days earlier, Sarah Mae Henderson had never even heard the name Jacob Sterling. She was just passing through Pitching Creek, a miserable little town where the dust seemed to get into your soul. She was tired, broke, and 6 months pregnant with a secret that had chased her halfway across the country. She was headed to California, to a new life, to a place where no one knew her name. And then she saw the crowd, and in the center of the crowd, on a wooden platform, she saw him. He was tall and strong, even in chains. His hair was dark and matted, his face covered in a rough beard, but his eyes were as green as new spring grass, and they held a fire that all the shackles in the world couldn't extinguish. The auctioneer, a greasy man with yellow teeth, was shouting, "Next up, gentlemen, a prime specimen. This here is Jacob Sterling. Strong as an ox, but a bit of trouble. Nothing a firm hand can't fix. Starting bid at $50. Sarah felt sick. They were selling a human being like a piece of livestock. Her father, for all his faults, had taught her that slavery was a sin. She turned to walk away, to get back on her horse and leave this wretched town behind. But she couldn't. She looked back at the man on the block, at the quiet dignity in his eyes, and saw a reflection of her own trapped soul. The bidding started. A rancher in a fancy suit called out, 60! Sarah's hand went to the small purse tied to her waist. Inside was $75.27. Every penny she had in the world. It was her ticket to California, her fresh start. 65! Someone else yelled. Sarah watched the hope slowly fade from Jacob Sterling's eyes. Not the hope for freedom, but the hope for a kind master. He was surrendering to his fate. And in that moment, something inside Sarah snapped. $75, she called out, her voice clear and steady. The entire crowd went silent. They turned to stare at the pregnant woman in the dusty blue dress. The auctioneer's eyes widened. 75 from the lady? Do I hear 80? The fancy rancher just shook his head and backed away. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down. Sold! To the lady for $75. The crack of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. What had she just done? She had just spent her entire future on a complete stranger, a man in chains, a man with a fire in his eyes that promised trouble. She had just bought a slave, or so she thought. The truth was far, far more complicated. Later that day, in a tiny room above a noisy saloon, Sarah watched the man she now supposedly owned. The shackles were off, leaving angry red marks on his wrists. He ate the stew she'd bought him slowly, cautiously, his green eyes never leaving her face. The silence was thick and heavy. You don't have to stay, she said finally. I mean, I know what the law says, but that's not why I did it. He put down his spoon. His gaze was intense, unnerving. Why did you buy me? It was a simple question with 1,000 answers. She walked to the window and looked down at the filthy street below. I saw you on that platform, she said, her back to him, and I thought about what it would feel like to be property, to have people look at you and not see a person. She turned back to face him, and I had $75 to my name. It wasn't enough to get me where I was going anyway. I figured it might as well do some good. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. You spent your last dollar on me. I did, she said. Why? He asked again, softer this time. How could she explain it? How could she tell this stranger that she saw the same caged look in his eyes that she saw in the mirror every morning? I reckon we're both running from something, she said instead. Figured we might as well run together. A small, humorless smile touched his lips. What makes you think I'm running? A man doesn't end up on an auction block because he's living a quiet life, she shot back. Besides, you've got the look. I know it well. He was quiet for a long moment. Where are you headed? California, she said. My sister has a boarding house in Sacramento. She said she'd give me work until, she gestured to her swollen stomach, until the baby comes. His eyes flickered down to her belly, then back to her face. And the father? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's hand instinctively twisted the wedding ring on her finger. He's dead, she said, killed in a farming accident. It wasn't a complete lie. Her husband, Thomas, was dead, but the baby wasn't his. That was a secret she planned to take to her grave. I'm sorry, Jacob said, and the sincerity in his voice surprised her. Thank you, she replied. Now what about you? What's your story? His face darkened. It's nothing worth telling. Try me. He shook his head. Some stories are better left buried. Sarah watched him, the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders tensed. Whatever put him on that platform, it had left deep scars. All right, she said, but if we're going to travel together, I need to know one thing. Are you a dangerous man? He met her gaze and his green eyes seemed to look right through her. Not to you. That's not what I asked. His answer came back, cold and measured. I have never hurt a woman or a child, and I never will. Beyond that, it depends who's asking and why. It wasn't a comforting answer, but it was an honest one. And in Sarah's world, honesty was rarer than gold. Here's the deal, she said, laying it all out. We both need to get to California. I have a horse and a few dollars left. You're a strong man. A woman in my condition traveling alone is a target. A woman traveling with her husband is just another settler. Jacob stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. You want me to pretend to be your husband? I want you to help me get to California safely, she corrected. In exchange, I'll help you. Once we get there, you're free to go. And if I say no, he challenged. She shrugged, a gesture far more casual than she felt. Then you're free to go right now. I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you to free you. He stood up and walked to the window, his tall frame blocking the fading light. He was quiet for so long she thought he had already decided to leave. Then he spoke, his voice low and heavy. There are men looking for me. A chill went down her spine. What kind of men? The kind that don't give up. Why are they looking for you? She pressed. He turned from the window, his face a mask of stone. You sure you want to open that door? Yes. He took a deep breath. They say I killed a man. A good man. Robbed him and left him to die on the side of a road. Sarah's stomach twisted into a knot. Did you? No, he said. And the way he said it, with such absolute, unwavering conviction, she believed him. But the truth doesn't matter, he went on. They've got a bounty poster with my face on it. $500, dead or alive. $500. It was a fortune, enough money to change her life forever. For a split second she thought about it. She saw the poster, saw his face, saw the reward. Then she looked at the man standing in front of her, a man who expected betrayal, who was waiting for her to turn on him. And something inside her hardened. Well, she said, forcing a confidence she didn't feel. I reckon that settles it. He looked confused. Settles what? We definitely need to travel together, she said with a small smile. If you're traveling alone, a man with a bounty on his head, you're an easy target. But a man traveling with his pregnant wife? Nobody looks twice at a family. He stared at her, a flicker of something she couldn't name in his eyes. Was it hope? You're serious, he breathed. Dead serious, she said. Jacob Sterling, I spent the last of my money on you. I'm 6 months pregnant and 1,000 miles from home. I'm pretty sure my situation can't get any worse. He gave a dark, humorless chuckle. You'd be surprised. Maybe, she said, stepping closer, but I'd rather face whatever's coming with you than face it alone. She held his gaze, refusing to back down. The question is, would you? He was silent for a long, long time. Then slowly he nodded. I suppose I would. Good, she said, a wave of relief washing over her. Then it's settled. We leave at first light. For the first time, a genuine smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows. Just like that, he said. Just like that, she confirmed. A new thought struck her, a dark and unsettling one. The bounty poster, $500. Who put up that kind of money for a simple ranch hand? And why did they want him dead or alive? She had a terrible feeling that the man he was accused of killing wasn't just some random stranger. And she was right. The man Jacob Sterling was accused of murdering was Samuel Morrison, the man who had raised him, the man who had been like a father to him. The real story was so much darker than she could ever have imagined. 3 days later, they were camped by a stream under a blanket of stars. The trail had been hard, but Jacob had proven to be a capable partner. He was efficient, resourceful, and surprisingly gentle. He never complained, and he always took the first watch, and usually the second one too. As they sat by the fire, Sarah watched him clean his revolver. His movements were precise, economical, the movements of a man who knew his way around a weapon. Where did you learn to shoot like that? She asked, breaking the comfortable silence. His hands stilled for a second. My father taught me, he said, his voice quiet. He was a businessman, cattle, but he believed a man should be prepared. My father was a preacher, Sarah offered. He believed the only weapon a man needed was prayer. A ghost of a smile touched Jacob's lips. And do you believe that? I used to, she said, staring into the flames. Then I learned the world is a lot more complicated than my father's sermons. Jacob finished cleaning the gun and reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small hand-carved wooden cross on a leather cord. He turned it over and over in his hands, his expression unreadable. I've seen you with that before, Sarah said softly. At night, When you think I'm asleep. He nodded, his gaze distant. It belonged to Samuel Morrison, he said, the man who raised me. It was the first time he had volunteered any information about his past. Sarah held her breath, afraid to break the spell. He gave it to me when I went off to the war. Jacob continued, his voice barely a whisper. You fought in the war? She asked, surprised. His jaw tightened. I was a chaplain's assistant. Too young to fight, they said, but old enough to hold a dying boy's hand and listen to him call for his mother. The pain in his voice was so raw, so fresh, it was as if the war had ended yesterday. Sarah had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who had come back from the fighting. They came back, but they left a part of themselves behind on the battlefield. What happened? She asked gently. After the war? He slipped the cross back into his pocket, the walls coming back up around him. Some wounds don't heal, Sarah, he said, his voice flat. They just scab over until something tears them open again. She knew she shouldn't push, but she had to know. Was Samuel Morrison, the man they say you killed, was he the one who tore them open? Jacob went very still. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of stone. When he finally looked at her, his green eyes were filled with a pain so deep it stole her breath. Samuel didn't just raise me, he said, his voice cracking. He was my father's business partner. He and my brother Marcus and I, we were supposed to be a family. A terrible realization began to dawn on Sarah. The man calling for Jacob's death, the man who had stood in the crowd with a satisfied smile on his face, his own brother. What happened, Jacob? She whispered. He took a long, shaky breath. Samuel owned a big ranch outside of Denver. He never married, had no kids of his own. He treated Marcus and me like sons. But Marcus was always greedy. He wanted it all. When Samuel told us he was selling the ranch and splitting the money between us, Marcus lost his mind. What did he do? She pressed. He started stealing cattle, selling them off, pocketing the money. When Samuel found out, he confronted him. He threatened to go to the sheriff. Jacob's voice went cold, dead. So Marcus killed him. He ambushed him on the road back from town, and he made damn sure every piece of evidence pointed straight at me. The betrayal was so monstrous, so absolute, Sarah could barely comprehend it. Your own brother, she breathed. My own brother, Jacob confirmed, his voice thick with hate. He planted the stolen gold in my saddlebags. He paid witnesses to say they saw me riding away from the scene. He even cried at the funeral, cried and pointed his finger at me as the killer. Sarah felt sick. This wasn't just a simple frame-up. This was something out of a nightmare. But the bounty, she said, a new, horrifying thought taking shape. $500 is a lot of money. Why would he? Because it's not about the money, Jacob interrupted, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. It's about making sure I'm silenced. Permanently. Dead or alive, it says on the poster. He knows I can prove my innocence. He just needs to make sure I never get the chance. And that's when Sarah understood. The men hunting them weren't just bounty hunters. They were assassins. And Marcus Sterling would stop at nothing to see his brother buried. He wouldn't just kill Jacob. If she was in the way, he would kill her too. And her unborn child. Suddenly, the journey to California wasn't just a run for freedom. It was a race against death. The town of Willow Creek was a boil on the face of the prairie, a handful of rundown buildings baked under the relentless sun. But they were out of supplies, and Sarah's horse, Bessie, needed rest. As they rode into town, a feeling of dread settled over Sarah like a shroud. I'll see to the horses, Jacob said, his voice low. He pulled his hat down, shadowing his face. You get what we need. It's better if we're not seen together too much. Sarah nodded. The trading post was dark and smelled of dust and old leather. A big, suspicious-looking man stood behind the counter, his eyes lingering on her pregnant belly. Help you, ma'am, he grunted. Just need some coffee and beans, she said, forcing a smile. As she gathered the supplies, her eyes fell on a piece of paper nailed to a wooden beam, and her blood ran cold. It was a brand new wanted poster. The ink was still fresh. The sketch of Jacob was frighteningly accurate, though the artist had given him a cruel, menacing sneer. But it was the words beneath the sketch that made her heart stop. Wanted, Jacob Sterling, for the murder of Samuel Morrison, $500 reward. And then a new line added at the bottom, known to be traveling with a pregnant woman. Consider both armed and dangerous. They knew. Marcus knew she was with him. See, you're admiring our local celebrity, the shopkeeper said, nodding toward the poster. Killed a good man up in Colorado, they say. Robbed him blind. Word is, he's headed this way. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Between you and me, ma'am, you ought to be careful. A man like that, running with a woman in your condition, he ain't gonna be too particular about who gets hurt. Sarah's hands were shaking as she paid for the supplies. She had to get out of there. She had to warn Jacob. She practically ran out of the store. Jacob was waiting by the horses, his body tense, alert. He saw the look on her face and knew instantly that something was wrong. We need to go, she whispered, her voice tight with panic. Now. They rode out of Willow Creek in silence, pushing their horses hard. When they were finally clear of the town, Sarah pulled Bessie to a stop. She couldn't hold it in any longer. She pulled the poster from her pocket. She'd torn it down when the shopkeeper wasn't looking, and handed it to Jacob. He read it without a word, his jaw tightening until it was a line of solid rock. When he looked up, his eyes were bleak. Sarah, he said, his voice heavy with a terrible finality. This changes everything. He knows you're with me. He's made you a target. So what do we do? She asked, her own fear echoing in her voice. We split up, he said, the words like a death sentence. Tonight. You take Bessie and what's left of the money. You ride to the next town and you tell them I kidnapped you. You tell them you escaped. They'll believe you. Marcus won't hurt you if he thinks you're a victim. And leave you to face them alone? She cried. Absolutely not. I'm not abandoning you. This isn't a game, Sarah, he shot back, his voice harsh with desperation. These aren't just bounty hunters. They're my brother's men. They have orders to kill me, and they will kill you to get to me. Don't you understand? I understand that I'm tired of running, she yelled, tears of frustration streaming down her face. I've been running my whole life. I ran from my father's fists. I ran from the whispers in my hometown when my husband died and left me pregnant with another man's child. I'm not running anymore, Jacob. The confession hung in the air between them. Jacob stared at her, his anger draining away, replaced by a dawning understanding. The baby, he said softly. It wasn't your husband's. No, she whispered. It belongs to a man who promised me the world, and then left me with nothing but shame. She looked him straight in the eye, her own pain raw and exposed. From where I'm standing, we're not so different. We're both being hunted for something we didn't do. You for a murder you didn't commit, and me for carrying a child that proves I'm not the perfect little widow everyone thought I was. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then for the first time since she'd met him, Jacob Sterling smiled. A real smile. It lit up his whole face and reached his eyes. You, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. You are either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish. Probably both, she admitted, but I won't let your brother win. I won't let him destroy you. A new resolve hardened in her eyes. Splitting up is exactly what they expect us to do. So we're going to do the opposite. We're going to disappear. How? He asked. The poster says they're looking for Jacob Sterling, the dark-haired fugitive, and his pregnant victim, she said, a wild plan forming in her mind. But they're not looking for John and Mary Thompson, a respectable young married couple, heading west to start a new life. He stared at her, a spark of hope igniting in his eyes. You think we can fool them? I think we have to try, she said. We'll change our appearance, cut our hair, buy new clothes. We'll become different people. Jacob's smile turned into a grin. And where are we supposed to get the money for all that? Leave that to me, she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. She was tired of being the victim. She was tired of running. From now on, she was fighting back. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. And their first target was Marcus Sterling's perfect deadly plan. That night, by the light of a flickering campfire, the transformation began. Sarah pulled a pair of scissors from her bag. Your turn first, she said to Jacob. The beard has to go. And the hair. We need to make you look like a respectable clerk, not a wanted man. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. As she cut his hair and he shaved away the beard that had hidden his face for so long, a new man emerged. Younger, less threatening, but the strong jaw and the intensity in his green eyes remained. When he was done, he looked like a completely different person, a stranger. "My turn," she said. She worked a mixture of lemon juice and chamomile tea through her long brown hair, a trick her sister had taught her years ago. By the time she was done, her hair was several shades lighter, a warm honey blonde. Then she took the scissors and, with a deep breath, began to cut. She chopped off nearly a foot of her hair, shaping it into a stylish bob that barely brushed her shoulders. "I feel naked," she said, running her fingers through the short strands. Jacob looked at her, his expression serious. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice soft. The words hung in the air between them, simple and true. As they worked, they talked. They filled in the details of their new identities. John and Mary Thompson, from Kentucky, heading to California to claim a piece of land left to them by an uncle. They built a shared history, a web of lies so detailed, so believable, that they almost started to believe it themselves. But as they talked, the lines between the fiction and the reality began to blur. They were no longer just two strangers bound by circumstance. They were partners, allies, and something more, something deeper and far more dangerous. Late that night, as Sarah lay wrapped in her bedroll, she watched Jacob by the fire. He had the wooden cross out again, turning it over and over in his hands. "Jacob," she said softly, "the cross. Why do you carry it? After everything that's happened, do you still believe?" He was quiet for a long time. "I want to," he said finally, his voice thick with a pain that had nothing to do with his brother's betrayal. "But it's hard to believe in a merciful God when you've seen the things I've seen." He looked at her, his eyes shadowed in the firelight. "In the war, as a chaplain's assistant, I saw things that would make a devil weep. Boys younger than me, dying in the mud, screaming for their mothers. I held their hands. I prayed with them. And then I buried them." He took a shaky breath. "One day, a young boy, he couldn't have been more than 16. He was dying. He asked me to write a letter to his mother. He was delirious, talking about his home, his dog. And then he looked at me, his eyes so clear, and he said, 'It's not fair.' And he was right. It wasn't fair. None of it was. After that, I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep spouting empty words about God's plan. So I walked away. I deserted." Sarah's heart ached for him. The man on the wanted poster was a killer, but the man in front of her was just a boy who had been forced to see too much of the world's cruelty. "That's when I met Iron Bear," he continued. "He's the chief of a Lakota tribe up north. His hunting party found me, half dead from starvation and fever. They took me in. They saved my life. He's the only one who knows the truth, the real truth." "What truth?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. Jacob's eyes met hers, and what he said next changed everything. "Samuel Morrison's will," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The ranch wasn't supposed to be sold. It was supposed to go to Iron Bear's people. Samuel had made a promise to them years ago. The land was sacred to them. Marcus knew. He found out about the will, and he knew that if Samuel went through with it, he would get nothing. That's the real reason he killed him. It wasn't just about the money from the sale. It was about stealing the land itself." "But the will," Sarah said. "Where is it?" "Marcus destroyed it," Jacob said. "Or he thought he did. But Samuel was clever. He knew my brother. He made a copy." Jacob reached for the small wooden cross. With a flick of his thumb, a tiny hidden clasp opened. The cross split in two. Tucked inside was a minuscule, tightly folded piece of paper. It was the will, the proof, the key to his freedom. But it was more than that. It was a death sentence. Because if Marcus knew it existed, he would stop at nothing to get it. He wouldn't just send bounty hunters. He would come himself. And he would tear the world apart to bury that secret, and them, forever. The town of Cedar Falls was a different world. Clean streets, painted buildings, a sense of permanence. It felt safe, too safe. They checked into Miller's Hotel as Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, playing their parts to perfection. Jacob was the attentive husband, Sarah the delicate, expectant mother. Mrs. Miller, the kindly woman who ran the hotel, fussed over them, clucking sympathetically about the hardships of the trail. For 3 days they lived the lie. They rested, they ate hot meals, they slept in a real bed. And in the quiet moments, in the privacy of their room, the wall between John and Mary Thompson and Jacob and Sarah Sterling began to crumble completely. He would help her with her boots, his hands gentle on her swollen ankles. She would find her hand reaching for his in the night. They talked for hours, sharing the real stories of their pasts, the pain and the loss that had led them to this moment. The attraction between them was a current, strong, and undeniable, pulling them closer with every passing hour. He was no longer just a man she had saved. He was the man who had saved her, in 100 small ways. He had given her hope when she had none. "Jacob," she said one evening, as they stood by the window, watching the sun set over the distant mountains, "when this is all over, when you're free, what will you do?" He stared out the window, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been running for so long, I don't know how to do anything else." "Well," she said, her voice soft, "when you figure it out, I hope you remember that some of us believe you deserve to be happy." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. "Sarah," he whispered, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, "I don't know what I deserve, but I know that meeting you, it's the only thing that's made sense in a very long time." He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was gentle at first, a hesitant question. Then it deepened, filled with all the unspoken words, all the pent-up fear and longing of the past weeks. It was a kiss that promised a future they both knew they might never have. The dream was shattered on their third night. Sarah woke to find Jacob standing by the window, a rigid silhouette against the moonlight. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders," he said, his voice a low growl. "3 of them. They've been at the saloon asking questions." Sarah's blood ran cold. "About us. About a wanted man traveling with a pregnant woman. They were here. Marcus's men had found them." "We have to leave," she said, scrambling out of bed. "Now." "No," Jacob said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Running now is what they expect. It's an admission of guilt. We stay. We brazen it out. We are John and Mary Thompson, and we have nothing to hide." It was a terrifying gamble, but he was right. Their disguises were their only weapon. They had to trust them. The next morning they walked into the hotel dining room, Jacob's hand resting protectively on the small of Sarah's back. Mrs. Miller greeted them with her usual cheerful smile. "Sleep well, dears? We have some new guests this morning. Gentlemen on business, law business, from the sound of it." Just then the door opened, and 3 men walked in. The leader was a tall, cruel-looking man with a handlebar mustache. The second was squat and ugly, his face scarred by smallpox. But it was the third man that made Sarah's world stop turning. Younger than the others. Sandy hair, a face she knew as well as her own. It was James Fletcher, the father of her unborn child, the man she thought was dead. The teacup rattled in its saucer as Sarah's hand started to shake. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. James Fletcher was alive, and he was here, with them, the men who were hunting Jacob. "Mary!" Jacob's voice was a sharp whisper. "What is it? What's wrong?" She couldn't speak. She could only stare at the ghost who had just walked into her life. Jacob followed her gaze. His eyes narrowed, and a cold understanding dawned on his face. "You know him," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. He's the baby's father," she whispered, the words tearing at her throat. "I thought he was dead." Jacob's face was a mask of stone, but she could see the storm raging in his eyes. Before he could say anything, the man with the mustache, Harlan Wade, was approaching their table. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "a word, if you please." He didn't wait for an answer. "We're looking for a man named Jacob Sterling. You wouldn't have seen him, have you?" "Can't say that I have," Jacob replied, his voice smooth as glass. But Wade wasn't buying it. His eyes raked over Jacob's face. "You know," he said slowly, "you look mighty familiar." The trap was closing. Sarah could feel it. The air grew thick, heavy. Any second now the lie would shatter, and the violence would begin. "My wife isn't feeling well," Jacob said, standing up and helping Sarah to her feet. "Morning sickness." They started for the stairs, but Wade blocked their path. "Just one more question," he said, his eyes now fixed on Sarah. From across the room, James Fletcher was watching them, his face pale, his expression unreadable. What was he doing here? Why was he with these men? Did he know? Did he recognize her? It was too much. The room started to spin. Sarah swayed on her feet. Jacob's arm tightened around her. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now!" As they reached the top of the stairs, a shot rang out from the dining room below. Screams erupted. Chaos. Someone had made a move. Jacob didn't hesitate. He grabbed her hand and pulled her down the hallway. "The back way," he hissed. They burst out into the alley behind the hotel, just as Harlan Wade and the scarred man, Jenkins, came crashing through the back door, guns drawn. They were trapped. "Nowhere to run, Sterling," Wade snarled. But just as he raised his pistol, a third figure appeared at the mouth of the alley. James Fletcher, and he had his rifle pointed straight at Wade. "Let them go," James said, his voice cold and steady. Wade laughed. "You switching sides, Fletcher? There's no money in that." "I'm not here for the money," James said, his eyes locked on Sarah. "Let them go, or I'll put a bullet in you myself." For a tense, heart-stopping moment, no one moved. It was a standoff. 3 armed men and Sarah and Jacob trapped in the middle. Then all hell broke loose. Jacob shoved Sarah behind him and charged Wade, tackling him to the ground. Jenkins fired, the bullet whizzing past Jacob's head. James fired back, his shot taking Jenkins in the shoulder. The man screamed and went down. "Go!" James yelled at them. "Get to the livery! I'll hold them off!" Jacob didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Sarah's hand and they ran, the sound of gunshots echoing behind them. They reached the livery stable, saddled their horses with shaking hands, and galloped out of town. They rode hard, not looking back, pushing their horses to the limit. They didn't stop until they were miles away, hidden deep in a rocky canyon. "What was that?" Sarah gasped, her heart still pounding. "What was James doing?" "I don't know," Jacob said, his face grim, "but he just saved our lives." But had he? Or had he just traded one danger for another? James Fletcher was alive. He knew she was here, and he was with the men who wanted Jacob dead. The simple lie of John and Mary Thompson was gone forever. And now they weren't just running from Marcus Sterling's assassins. They were running from a ghost from Sarah's past. A ghost who had just proven he was willing to kill to get what he wanted. And Sarah had a sinking feeling that what he wanted was her. The chase was relentless. For days they rode, barely stopping to eat or sleep. They knew Wade and Jenkins would be right behind them. And James, they didn't know where he was or what he would do next. The wound on Jacob's side, a graze from one of the bullets in the alley, festered. He grew pale and weak, but he never complained. He just pushed on, his jaw set, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Sarah's own body was screaming in protest. The baby was a heavy weight, and the constant riding left her exhausted and sore. But she pushed on too, for Jacob, for her unborn child, for the tiny flickering hope of a future. They were heading north, toward the Lakota territory, toward Chief Iron Bear. "He's our only chance," Jacob said, his voice raspy with pain and fatigue. "He has the will. He can prove my innocence." One evening as they made camp in a hidden ravine, Jacob collapsed. The fever from his wound had finally taken over. He was delirious, muttering about the war, about his brother, about Samuel Morrison. Sarah did what she could. She cleaned the wound, bathed his face with cool water, and forced him to drink. She sat with him through the night, holding his hand, whispering words of encouragement, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. As dawn broke, he opened his eyes. The fever had broken. He was weak, but he was lucid. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "you're still here." "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He looked at her, his green eyes filled with a raw, unguarded tenderness. "If we don't make it," he started. Don't, she said, putting a finger to his lips. We are going to make it. But if we don't, he insisted, I need you to know, these last few weeks, they've been the best of my life. Tears welled in her eyes. Me too, she whispered. And in that quiet, desperate moment, they both knew that this was no longer a partnership of convenience. It was something real, something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. They were just about to set out again when a figure appeared at the top of the ravine. It was James Fletcher. He was alone, and he had his rifle in his hands. That's far enough, Sterling, he called down. Jacob struggled to his feet, pulling Sarah behind him. What do you want, Fletcher? I'm here to help, James said, making his way down the rocky slope. Wade and Jenkins are a day behind you, but they won't give up, not with $500 on the line. Why would you help us? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed on her face. Because I was wrong, Sarah, he said, his voice filled with a regret that sounded genuine. I was a fool, a coward. I should have never let you go. It's a little late for that, Jacob growled, his hand on his revolver. Maybe, James said, his gaze never leaving Sarah. But it's not too late to fix it. I can lead you to the Lakota. I know the way. I can get you to Iron Bear. It was a trap. It had to be. But what choice did they have? Jacob was in no condition to travel, let alone fight. They were sitting ducks. What's your price? Jacob asked, his voice laced with suspicion. James finally looked at him. My price is her safety, he said, and a chance. Just a chance to talk to her, to explain. Sarah looked from Jacob's pale, stubborn face to James's earnest, pleading one. She was caught between two worlds, her past and her future. We'll go with you, she said, making a decision. But if this is a trick, James, I swear to you, I will be the one to kill you. The journey was tense. James led them through a maze of canyons and hidden trails, his knowledge of the terrain undeniable. Jacob rode in a stony silence, his hatred for James a palpable thing. Sarah was torn. Part of her wanted to believe James, to believe that he had changed. But her heart belonged to Jacob. They were only a few miles from the Lakota border when it happened. A sudden, sharp pain shot through Sarah's lower back. She gasped, doubling over in the saddle. What is it? Jacob was by her side in an instant. It's the baby, she breathed, another wave of pain washing over her. It's coming. No, Jacob said, his face paling. It's too early, 2 months too early. But the baby didn't care about schedules. The pains were coming faster now, harder. We have to find shelter, James said, his own face a mask of panic. There's an old hunting camp nearby. They made it to the camp just as the contractions became unbearable. It was a crude, three-walled shelter, but it was better than nothing. And there, on a bed of furs, with Jacob holding one hand and James the other, Sarah Mae Henderson went into labor. The hours that followed were a blur of agony and fear. The baby was in the wrong position. The labor was long and brutal. Sarah was exhausted, ready to give up. But Jacob was there, his voice a steady anchor in the storm, guiding her, encouraging her. You can do this, Sarah, he whispered, his face beaded with sweat. You're the strongest woman I know. And James was there too, his earlier panic replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He held her, supported her, his presence a surprising comfort. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Sarah gave one final, monumental push. A tiny, wailing cry filled the air. It's a girl, Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the impossibly small infant on Sarah's chest. A perfect little girl. Sarah looked down at her daughter, so fragile, so new, and a wave of love so powerful it stole her breath, washed over her. She had survived. They had all survived. Hope, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her name is Hope. But their moment of peace was short-lived. A shout from outside the shelter shattered the calm. They're here, James yelled. Wade and Jenkins, and they've got men with them. Jacob was on his feet in an instant, his gun in his hand. Get Sarah and the baby out of here, he said to James. I'll hold them off. No, Sarah cried. Jacob, don't. But it was too late. The bounty hunters were swarming the camp. Gunshots erupted. Jacob returned fire, using the meager cover of the shelter. "Go!" he roared at James. "Get them to safety!" James hesitated for a split second, his eyes meeting Sarah's, and in that moment she saw his choice. He wasn't going to run. He handed her a small derringer. "If they get past us," he said, his voice grim, "you know what to do." And then he was gone, joining Jacob in the desperate, impossible fight. Sarah huddled in the back of the shelter, clutching hope to her chest, listening to the terrifying sounds of the gunfight. It was a massacre. There were too many of them. She could hear Jacob cry out in pain. She heard James shouting his name. And then, silence. A terrible, ringing silence. It was over. Harlan Wade appeared at the entrance of the shelter, his face smeared with dirt and blood, a triumphant sneer on his lips. "Well, well," he said, his eyes landing on Sarah and the baby. "Look what we have here." Jenkins was right behind him, his arm in a sling, his ugly face twisted in a grin. "Where's Sterling?" he growled. Sarah clutched Hope tighter, the small derringer cold and heavy in her hand. She looked past them, out into the clearing, and her heart broke. Jacob was on the ground, motionless. James was next to him, trying to stop the bleeding from a wound in Jacob's chest. "He's finished," Wade said with a shrug, "but we still get the bounty. And as for you," he took a step toward her. But before he could take another, a new voice cut through the air, a voice of pure authority. "That is far enough." Standing at the edge of the clearing, as if they had materialized out of the evening shadows, were a dozen Lakota warriors. They were silent, imposing figures, their rifles leveled, and at their head a tall, noble-looking man with eyes that seemed to see into a man's soul. Chief Iron Bear. Wade and Jenkins froze, their faces draining of color. They were surrounded, trapped. "You are on my land," Iron Bear said, his voice calm but filled with an iron will. "You will drop your weapons." Wade hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly, he let his pistol fall to the ground. Iron Bear walked into the clearing, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He looked at Jacob, and a flicker of recognition, of sorrow crossed his face. Then he looked at Sarah, at the tiny baby in her arms. "You have come," he said to her, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We have been waiting." And then another figure stepped out from behind the warriors. A man in a fine suit, his face a mask of cold fury. Marcus Sterling. He had come to watch his brother die. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the Lakota. This wasn't part of his plan. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Iron Bear turned to him, his eyes like chips of flint. "The meaning," he said, "is that the lies are over." He held up a small, folded piece of paper. The will. "Samuel Morrison was my friend," he said, his voice resonating through the clearing. "And this land belongs to my people. You, Marcus Sterling, are a murderer and a thief, and your reign of terror is at an end." Marcus stared at the will, his face contorting in a mask of rage and disbelief. He had lost. Everything he had schemed for, everything he had killed for, was gone. With a desperate cry, he drew a hidden pistol and fired. Not at Iron Bear, but at Sarah, at the baby, at the last living piece of the family he had tried to destroy. But James Fletcher, wounded and bleeding, threw himself in front of them, taking the bullet meant for them. He collapsed at Sarah's feet, a small, sad smile on his face. "I told you," he whispered, his eyes on his daughter. "I told you I'd fix it." And then he was gone. In the chaos that followed, Marcus was captured by the warriors. Harlan Wade and Jenkins were taken into custody, and as the Lakota healers rushed to Jacob's side, working desperately to save his life, Sarah could only kneel, holding her daughter, weeping for the man who had given his life for them, and praying for the man who held her heart. The long night was finally over, but a new day, a new life, was just beginning. Jacob survived. With the help of the Lakota and the evidence of the will, his name was cleared. Marcus was tried and hanged for the murder of Samuel Morrison, on the very same gallows he had built for his brother. Jacob and Sarah, with little hope, didn't go to California. They stayed. On the land that Samuel Morrison had loved, they built a home, a real home, a place of safety, of love, of family. It wasn't the life either of them had planned. It was messy and complicated and built on the ashes of tragedy, but it was theirs, and it was beautiful. They had faced down death, betrayal, and the ghosts of their past, and they had won, not just their freedom, but each other. If you enjoyed this story of survival, betrayal, and the incredible power of love, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what story we'll uncover next.